How do you look from a philosophical point of view at previous generations that seem to be so enlightened yet so unable to apply their own principles consistently? The biggest example is Thomas Jefferson writing about men being created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Meanwhile, having a slave owner, George Washington, leading a tax revolt and then engaging in the whiskey collection tax, or Christopher Columbus. How do you, as a philosopher, try to think about were they just evil opportunists, or were they really good people who were just unable to apply their own principles consistently because they didn't have access to DuckDuckGo?
Yeah, I'm gonna leave Christopher Columbus off to the side because everybody's really pissed at him right now. Um, it was Columbus Day a couple of days, maybe a week ago. So I think it profits us nothing at all to talk about him. But to talk about
Jefferson's a great example, I think.
Yeah, I think Jefferson's the best example, actually, because in the Declaration, he wrote the sentence that changed history. He wrote the most powerful sentence ever written. That's a hell of a thing to say about somebody. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Yeah. Every single revolutionary movement from Jefferson's time to the present has latched onto that sentence. Think about that for a second. I'm talking about communist revolutions, gender revolutions, no matter how you want to frame it up. There's Jefferson standing right in the middle of all of it. And yet we know for a fact that he did not free his own slaves. And that is an indictment. There's no question. That's an indictment. But I want to make this a little more complicated, because in one of Jefferson's letters, he said, slavery in our midst is like having a wolf by the ears in the forest. What do? Do you take your hands off the wolf? Because if you do, he'll devour you. Or do you keep on holding the wolf? Because if you do, you'll get tired. You'll let him go and he will devour you. And that was what Jefferson thought slavery would yield here. I get that. That's actually a sensible thing to believe. Had I been a slave, I don't think I could have let it go. I don't think I could have made peace with it the way that many, if not most, slaves did. It's astonishing to me when I see human beings and their capacity to forgive. I think about Nelson Mandela in South Africa, right? The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where people come and say, I did this. They tell the truth and then they're allowed to leave, go on with their lives again. So Jefferson, in the Constitution, there was a sunset clause. Congress could not legislate against slavery until a certain point in time. Well, that certain point in time turned out to overlap with Thomas Jefferson's presidency. And on the day they were able constitutionally to legislate against slavery, they did. And it hit Thomas Jefferson's desk and he signed it. That was his goal. He signed the first piece of anti-slavery legislation that went through the United States Congress. We don't remember that about him. We don't remember that he thought it was a losing bet no matter what. We just blame him for getting it wrong on a very meaningful level. I can forgive him that to a point. I guess maybe you don't forgive it, you don't overlook it, but you strive to understand it. And I understand where he was coming from. There was no way at a certain point in our history to even think about freeing all the slaves. There was just no way. It would have cost us what was known as the unanimous Declaration of Independence, right? It would have been probably 2, maybe 3 countries instead of 1. And if you ended up there, would slavery ever have been outlawed? Well, it would have taken a lot longer. And even as it went, it took us a civil war, the price we paid in blood for our original sin. What more can you say about it, right? This is just what it was. It was the price we paid in blood for our original sin.
Now, Niall Ferguson says that, yes, there was slavery, there was Native American mass murders very frequently. All of these terrible negative things that are said about America and the West are the least original things about the West. So, are we really bringing something to the table to say, oh, they were a bunch of racist slave owners? It's like, okay, everyone throughout all of humanity was. Here's where they improved. Where, I mean, it's hard to stand on the shoulders of giants when there's not that many around to stand on.
Well, to answer that question in the most direct way, the way I answer it to America's harshest critics, who tend to be Americans. This is what I have to say to them. Maybe it'll work for you as well. I don't know, but the United States did not invent slavery. Slavery is actually mankind's de facto position. We have had slavery from as far back as we have records. The very first law code that we have, actually, it's a little scrap of a larger law code. What is it about? How you have to treat your slaves. So as far as the laws of nations and times and places, all the laws go, they all somehow dealt with slavery. Now, American slavery was different. It was chattel slavery. Greek slavery would have been who conquered who in the last war, right? So you could literally be in Greece a princess one day and a slave the next, given how the battle went. So it's not the same animal, right? But that's interesting too. We've got all kinds of different slavery. And okay, fine. Here we have the United States with slavery at the founding, a founding dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That's really bad. And yet, 77 years later, it was over with. Think about that. It's the natural fallback position of the human race for thousands of years. America's founded, and 77 years later, it's over. Amazing. England beat us to the punch by a little bit. So they had done away with slavery before we did. By the time England and the United States do away with it, it's really not safe anywhere. Where do you find it now? Not in the Western world, you don't.
Oh, certainly. Certainly not the institutionalized recognition of slavery. Yeah, of course, there are kidnappings, there are slave farms, which I'm familiar with those. But about the institutionalized recognition, I remember Camille Foster was on a panel, and they were like, we have to, recognize America's past with slavery. And he goes, yeah, it's not really fair to pin slavery on America, considering it's about as old as writing. And that was just such a funny way to put it, because it's like, yeah, it's like saying, that Asians steal. It's like, yes, Asians steal, but so do whites and blacks and Mexicans. Well, why are you just pinning it on that? That's just you being intentionally divisive in an unproductive way. Yeah, but Asians steal, You're not bringing anything to the table that's literally like saying Americans have slaves, or America was racist, or is racist, or institutional, all this nonsense.
It's become rather fashionable, right? I meet young people, 14, 15, 16 years old. I meet them often, and they legitimately think that the Americans invented the institution of slavery.
The former vice presidential candidate, Tim Kaine, said, when we came to America in Virginia, we brought over slaves. We didn't inherit slavery. We invented it. That was Tim Kaine, the former vice presidential candidate to Hillary Clinton. So, yeah, I don't know if I thought that, but I would have been curious to ask. It'd be curious to ask myself in middle school. When did slavery start? About 1700s, I think I would have said. And that's just incredible. Not because they ever said this is when it started. It said the thing about America is slavery and Native American mass murder. It's like what you're implying is the unique thing is this, when, as Niall Ferguson correctly says, it's the least unique thing.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And whenever you witness base human behavior, you should understand it for what it is. It's part of human nature. And if you see it in one place, you're probably going to see it in almost every place. And because human nature is that kind of thing that it's very difficult to overcome it. Now, I think we have in a number of ways throughout human history, and when we do, it's to be celebrated. Right? It's a big deal, for example, that the United States one day woke up and said, we can't do this anymore. Now, they had a war to sort it out, the bloodiest war in human history until its time. But look at what had to happen to even have that, to have a war about it. You had to have enough people saying, all right, it's worth our looking into this and it's worth our fighting for it. And we really paid a hell of a price for that.
Certainly the abolitionists risking their lives, not exactly the most popular thing. To talk to people now about holding the wolf by the ears, deciding whether or not to let it go, what I think of now, this might be a whole nother discussion, but the research I've done, and I make the case for this in a video titled Why They Hate Us, intentionally provocative, that if you look at the writings of a lot of jihadis, the reason they want to more or less wage war against the West is because since the early 90s, there were terrible sanctions on Iraq that killed a large number of civilians. They then were motivated, bin Laden's 1998 fatwa, between that and the alliance with Israel that killed a number of Muslims, that, well, this is why we're waging war against the U.S. So people that justify a lot of civilians getting killed in the war on terror and not getting much about it except more terrorists that are created, it's hard to say, well, yep, let's bring them all home. Well, we've pissed off a lot of people over there. So, I mean, the fact that today people justify war and mass murder should make you a little less uppity about judging Thomas Jefferson when, you know, he was at a time where there was still this conflict.
Again, I'd say, hello, everyone. How are you? Please pull out your Declaration of Independence. There are some things here I think maybe we should talk about. So what's the underlying thought? What's that main thought that goes through this thing? And, you know, sooner or later, somebody's going to say that all men are equal and that somehow we attach governance to this. And I would say, yes, that's exactly right, Pumpkin. Good for you. What about the rest of all the words in here? Why on earth were these indictments against King George separated right after the first two paragraphs, which set it up theoretically? Why then do they jump into a laundry list of complaints against a king that you probably know nothing about? And then I get dead silence. Right? Dead silence. I say, well, okay, maybe we should go back to the beginning, seeing that's the part that everybody's interested in. How do we get to the point where we take a slave owner seriously when he says all men are created equal? That seems a little odd, doesn't it? And, you know, people are going to answer that question in a very typical way, and they're going to tell me what a gruesome beast Jefferson was, at which point I'll agree with them. I'll say, well, that's probably right. But here's what gets really interesting, because if you look at those indictments against the king, they go from least serious to most serious. There's a rank order in that list. And you probably don't know this, but Jefferson wrote the rough draft of the Declaration. It was a piece of committee work. It was Jefferson and Ben Franklin and a bunch of other guys, Roger Livingston. There were 5 of them at any rate. And they decided that Thomas Jefferson, then 33 years old for crying out loud, should go write the first draft, which he did. But on Jefferson's first draft, there's a difference, a critical difference. There was a deleted indictment against King George at the very end of the list, which means it was most important. And that deleted indictment blamed the institution of slavery in America on the king and said in no uncertain terms that slavery was an abomination. So here we have a slave owner writing a Declaration of Independence to be given to a king who used the final slot, the slot for the most terrible indictment against the king. He took his argument there. So, was he a hypocrite? Yeah, probably. Was he a genius? Yep, that too. Did he really think that slavery was a positive good. Clearly he didn't. And that's where we're left. That's where our shared inquiry begins. We don't end there, we start there. And from here, we have to read Jefferson rather charitably. We have to understand the context in which the Declaration was written, and we have to understand what came next and why. And when you can get there, then we'll have some knowledge. Until then, we do not.
From History.com, why Thomas Jefferson's anti-slavery passage was removed from the Declaration of Independence. This is referring to a 168-word passage that condemned slavery as one of the many evils foisted upon the colonies by the British Crown, what the deleted passage said. In his initial draft, Jefferson blamed Britain's King George for his role in creating and perpetuating the transatlantic slave trade, which he describes in so many words as a crime against humanity. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights to life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. Jefferson went on to call the institution of slavery piratical warfare, execrable commerce, and an assemblage of horrors. He then criticized the Crown for exciting those very people to rise in our arms against us, and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them by murdering the people on whom he also obtruded them. He thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with the crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. This passage refers to a 1775 proclamation by Britain's Lord Dunmore, which offered freedom to any enslaved person in the American colonies who volunteered to serve in the British Army against the Patriots' revolt. The proclamation inspired thousands of enslaved people to seek liberty behind British lines during the Revolutionary War. Why was the Declaration's anti-slavery passage removed? The exact circumstances of the passage's removal may never be known. The historical record doesn't include details of the debates undertaken by the Second Continental Congress. What is known is that the 33-year-old Jefferson, who composed the Declaration between June 11th and June 28th, 1776, sent a rough draft to members of the Pre-Select Committee, including John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, also the founder of the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society, for edits ahead of its presentation to Congress. Between July 1st and July 3rd, congressional delegates debated the document, during which time they excised Jefferson's anti-slavery clause. The removal was mostly fueled by political and economic expediencies, while the 13 colonies were already deeply divided on the issue of slavery. Both South and North had financial stakes in perpetuating it. Southern plantations, a key engine of the colonial economy, needed free labor to produce tobacco, cotton, and other cash crops for export back to Europe. It's not free labor, it still costs a lot to house, clothe, and feed, so the problem is the enslavement, not the free part. Northern shipping merchants, who also played a role in that economy, remained dependent on the triangle trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas that included the traffic in enslaved Africans. Decades later, in his autobiography, Jefferson primarily blamed two southern states for the clause's removal, while acknowledging the North's role as well. The clause reprobating the enslaving the inhabitants of Africa was struck out in compliance to South Carolina and Georgia, who had never attempted to restrain the importation of slaves, and who, on the contrary, still wished to continue it. Our northern brethren also, I believe, felt a little tender under these censures, for though their people have very few slaves themselves, yet they had been pretty considerable carriers of them to others. Jefferson's anti-slavery actions. You know that nobody wishes more ardently to see an abolition not only of the trade, but of the condition of slavery, and certainly nobody will be more willing to encounter every sacrifice for that object. Thomas Jefferson to Brisset de Warville, February 11th, 1788. Early in his public life, Jefferson was one of the first statesmen anywhere to take action to end slavery. In 1778, he introduced a Virginia law prohibiting the importation of enslaved Africans. In 1784, he proposed a ban on slavery in Northwest Territory, new lands ceded by the British in 1783. In Notes on the State of Virginia, published in 1785, he proposed a plan of gradual emancipation, but after 1785, still holding his belief in the injustice of slavery, he was publicly silent. The Act Prohibiting Importation of Slaves of 1807 is a United States federal law that provided no new slaves were permitted to be imported into the United States. It took effect on January 1st, 1808, the earliest date permitted by the United States Constitution. This legislation, promoted by President Thomas Jefferson, who called for its enactment in his 1806 State of the Union address. He had promoted the idea since the 1770s. It reflected the force of the general trend towards abolishing the international slave trade, which Virginia, followed by all the other states, had prohibited or restricted since then. South Carolina, however, had reopened its trade. Congress first regulated against the trade in the Slave Trade Act of 1794. The 1794 Act ended the legality of American ships participating in the trade. The 1807 law did not change that. It made all importation from abroad, even on foreign ships, a federal crime. The British Parliament had passed the comparable Abolition of the Slave Trade Act on February 23, 1807, achieving royal assent on March 25, 1807. The domestic slave trade within the U.S. was not affected by the 1807 law. Indeed, with the legal supply of imported slaves terminated, the domestic trade increased in importance. In addition, some smuggling of slaves persisted. Here is the Thomas Jefferson State of the Union Address, December 2nd, 1806. I congratulate you, fellow citizens, on the approach of the period at which you may interpose your authority constitutionally to withdraw the citizens of the United States from all further participation in those violations of human rights which have so long continued on the unoffending inhabitants of Africa, and which the morality, the reputation, and the best interests of our country have long been eager to prescribe.